but it's good to have everybody here. We have been studying the I am sayings of, I shouldn't say some of the I am sayings of Jesus. Most of them have been and continue to be from the book of John. John, the 11th chapter, is a very interesting, very power-packed chapter as far as I'm concerned. What takes place in the 11th chapter of John? Lazarus is raised from the dead. Let me ask first of all, how many, we have some books. Who needs a book that doesn't have one? There's one back there, two over there, three here. Just take them all and see if you can. In his commentary, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, Alfred Edersheim says this at the start of chapter 11 regarding the resurrection of Lazarus. He says, "We have here the fullest evidence alike of his divinity and humanity as regards those who witnessed it, the highest manifestation of faith and of unbelief." And if you go back and think about that, and we're going to do some reading in it, because there's a statement in there that Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life." Got to fire yourself for one book. Jesus will tell Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life." Was this the first time or the only time or the first or only time that Jesus had ever raised anybody? Todd's thinking. I see the wheels. I see the wheels turning.
It's not the only time.
Not the only time. Okay. It's not the first time, because this was toward the end of his ministry. In fact, him raising Lazarus the way he did in such a public way turned the Sadducees really at that point began to come after him. In fact, this was only a few months before he was crucified. But he did raise at least two others. There are two that are listed in the New Testament. One was the widow son at Nain. As she was coming out, she was bearing her son, and he stopped her and he raised her son. And if I remember correctly, it was her only son. And it says here in Luke 7 that many of his disciples went with him and much people. So that miracle, that raising of the dead of a person, wasn't done in private. It wasn't done with a huge crowd apparently either, but it was public. He also raised the daughter of Jairus, who was kept the synagogue. But this was done, it's in Luke 8. He chose three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and her parents, and he went into the room where her body was. And he raised her. This was more of a private setting. But whenever he chose his disciples in Matthew the 10th chapter to be his apostles, he told them in the 8th verse, "Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils." We don't have any record that they ever did that. We have record that they had trouble with the devil at one time because they came back and said, "We couldn't cast this devil out." But even the disciples had that power. The apostles did. Let's go back in the Old Testament. Was anybody ever raised from the dead in the Old Testament? Yes, no, maybe? Yes. Who? Right. If you didn't hear Kelton, in 2 Kings 13, there's a story there that they were burying a dead man and some people came after them and they threw the body in a grave. And it happened to be the grave of Elisha. And when that body touched his grave, his bones, the man was brought back to life. But there are two other times that it happened, and it wasn't an accident like that one was. Elijah raised a widow's son, and that's in 1 Kings 17. And Elisha raised a widow's son in 2 Kings 4. 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 4. So the idea of people being raised from the dead, at least in the time of Jesus, was not totally foreign to them. I don't think it happened every day, but it wasn't unheard of. But when Jesus does it in John 11, toward the end of his ministry, it causes a tremendous stir. And we will get to that at the end, because there are reasons for that in there. But turn over there if you're not there, and let's do some reading. Let's read, Todd, if you don't mind, read the first. Let's take the first 8 verses, and Toby, do you mind taking the second 8 verses of Luke? I'm going to say Luke. John 11.
Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary was anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When he had heard therefore that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that saith he to his disciples, Let us go into Judea again. His disciples say unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again?
Okay, Toby.
Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. This he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go, so that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, so that we may die with him.
Okay, think about this. Lazarus is a very dear, close friend of Jesus, his sisters as well. And the actions that Jesus takes or doesn't take seem on the surface to be kind of opposite of what you would think a person would be. Here, Lazarus is sick. And Martha or the sister send a message to Jesus and say, the one you love is sick. What did they want him to do? Heal him. Make him well. But does Jesus leave? No. He said he stays there for a couple of days. But it says there he loved them. And it said when he heard this in verse 6, that he was sick, he abode 2 more days. And then he says to his disciples, let's go. Now, we're going to talk about why that happened, why he did that. But it seems on the surface you go, wait a minute, why is he doing it that way? He has reasons. And as we go further down there, he tells his disciples what? As he's saying this, he says, let's go back to verse 4. I shouldn't have gone that far. He tells them, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified thereby. It was true that it was going to result in his death, But that wasn't the ultimate goal of the thing. Jesus knew that this was going to happen. Jesus knew he would die. And Jesus also knew what? That he would raise him. This was an orchestrated thing, at least to a large extent. Jesus knew all about this. So what he's doing is delaying. And then look what he tells the disciples. I'm glad I wasn't there for your sakes, in verse 15. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there. And they go, well, wait a minute. To the intent that you may believe. What do they know about Jesus at this point in time? What do they believe about Jesus? What has he been telling them who he is? He's the Son of God. Do they fully understand the first? Now, they haven't read the first part of the book of John because it hadn't been written yet. But what we see in John, the first chapter, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Peter testified to him whenever in Matthew 16. Whom do men say that I am? He said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of God. But do they understand fully what that means? Probably not. Probably not. But here he says, this isn't for Lazarus' death, this is for what? The glory of God. To bring glory to God and to the Son of God. So it is a plan that Jesus has, and he is going to work it. Had he ever used this? He tells them that Lazarus is asleep first, which is technically right and technically wrong. Was Lazarus dead? His body was. His body was dead. And we use that phraseology to say he is dead. And the Bible does. That he is dead. But the body is dead because of why? Not because of why, but why? The spirit, the soul has left it. That's what death is, it's a separation. So the body's dead, but Lazarus lives on. Because remember what he told when he's discussing with the Pharisees and Sadducees about God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. He is saying that they are not dead. In fact, when he says in John the 8th chapter, before Abraham was, I am. And he says there, he told him before that, Abraham saw the Lord's day and was happy. Abraham was alive. And for God to be the God of the living and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, they had to be living. So Lazarus is living, but Lazarus is dead. So he uses the phrase, he's sleeping. Now, does the soul actually sleep? Probably not. But it's a phrase that he used. And he used it when he raised Jairus' daughter. Back over there in Mark the 5th chapter, he said, in verse 39, it says, When he was come in, he saith to them, Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleeps. And the next verse says, they laughed him to scorn. They knew she was dead, and Jesus knew the spirit had left her. But it was a moment also to teach. Going down to the next set of verses, the next 10 verses there. They decided. First of all, they decided to go. I'm not worried about Thomas. Thomas makes his comment whether you think he's ready to go and die or not ready to go and die. It really doesn't matter. Thomas isn't the part of this that we want. But what's about to happen is, and it says in verse 17, when Jesus came, and when he came to Bethany, he found that he had already lain in the grave 4 days. But now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs, which is about 2 miles. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then it says, Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Mary to Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Lord, if you had come, my brother would still be living. But look what she says. But I know that even now, whatsoever you ask of God, God will give it thee. Describe Mary's faith, Martha. Describe Martha's faith. What? Committed? A committed faith. Committed to what?
Committed to the truth that Jesus taught, committed that he was the Son of God, and whatever he said he could do.
Okay. But what did she believe about Lazarus now? Did she believe what he was about to do? I'm sorry? Yes, and that's brought out a little bit later here. Jesus said to her, Thy brother shall rise again, there in verse 23. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Does she have any faith? She expects Jesus to do something because she says, even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. What is her understanding of the relationship between God and Jesus? Is it that she says, I believe you're the Son of God. In fact, I know you are the Son of God. But does she believe that he is deity? Does she believe and understand what you and I understand and believe about Jesus? No. Otherwise, she wouldn't make the statement that she's there. She would understand. She doesn't understand that something that a Roman centurion understood. Do you remember the centurion? I don't remember where it was. Whose servant was sick, and he told Jesus, I got this servant there, he's sick, will you heal him? And he said, sure, I'll come. And he says, no, I don't want you to come. I'm not worthy of you to be in my house. But I'm a man under authority, I give directions, and they're taken, and you are as well. And you just say the word, and he will be healed. Could Jesus have, and Jesus did, by the way, could Jesus have made Lazarus sick before that without going to see Lazarus? Of course he could. She believes he had to be there, apparently, for that to take place. She says unto him, I know that he will rise in the day of the resurrection. Her statement of the Lord's intention to... Jesus makes a statement, thy brother shall rise again. He is talking about right now, right then. She is referring to it as at a far distant time. I know he will rise, Lord, at the last day when there's a general resurrection, he will rise. I don't know what she's really expecting when she says, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. But she doesn't understand that that's not how Jesus is working. He is doing the will of God. When he is here, he is doing what God has. And he says that several times. I do the will of him that sent me, the Father. And in verse 25, Jesus says these words. He said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. What does Jesus mean by, there's two separate phrases, I am the resurrection and I am the life. What does he mean by that? The next verse tells us, I think, what is said. He says that, then he says at the end of verse 25, he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. He makes two statements, and then he explains those two statements, at least on a level there. I believe the first one, I am the resurrection. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. True believers, because he says, he that believeth in me, though he were dead. Here's somebody who believes, was a believer, a follower of Jesus, and is dead, has passed on. What does he say about him? He will live. He will live.
Roger,
Yes, sir.
Job asked that question back and forth. If a man died, shall he live? And that's the answer to that question.
It is.
Verses right here is answering the question.
And he made a statement a little bit later that said, I know that I shall see my Redeemer,
I know my Redeemer lives.
And so we don't know exactly how he understood things, but he had some faith. There was faith that there was going to be, life after death. But it wasn't as pronounced as it was in the New Testament. If you go back and some of the things that Brother Campbell did in his lesson here, the pagans didn't believe that even God could raise the dead. Homer said it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So there's nobody outside of the Jewish people that have any notion of the dead being raised. So it's not out of the ordinary for Martha to think that, that, okay, he's talking about future resurrection. But he's telling her, no, it's not. Because why? Because he is the resurrection. He is the life. And when you have resurrection, what else do you have with it? What happens to that body? Life. That body comes back to life. Any questions, comments? I mean, as I've studied this, in fact, I got to a point reading some commentaries, and I said, wait a minute, I've got to talk to Bruce. And so Bruce and I spent some time yesterday talking about this. To me, it's been a fascinating study, just this part of it. Dan King, who wrote one of the truth commentaries, said this about verse 26. Possessing a relationship with the Son of God is so all-important that it is as if death did not exist at all. When those who are related to Jesus Christ in trusting, obedient faith pass from this world into the next, it is as if nothing unpleasant or distasteful has happened. Believing that this is so is what caused Paul to write, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain," in Philippians 1. And then again, "For we know that if the earthly house of our tabernacle be dissolved, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." That's the resurrection there. And that's what Paul's saying. Because of Jesus, we have that faith. But at the point we are here in the verses here in verse 27, Martha's not at that point. Ellicott, in his commentary, said that Martha also spoke of the resurrection as a truth which she believes and as an event in the far-off future. She believed in the resurrection, but she didn't believe in it. It's going to happen today. It was something that was far later on at the end. The first two words of Jesus' answer, according to this commentator, express the fullness of emphasis, teach her that the resurrection is to be thought of as his person, and that is to be thought of as actually present. He was present. Resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection is present life and not simply a life in the remoteness of the last day. He goes on to say, he declares himself to be the resurrection, revealing in his own person that all that men have ever thought and hoped of a future life, being himself the power shall raise them at the last day, and could therefore raise them now. Because of this, he is also alive. Meyer's commentary, he wrote this: the personal power of both the one who raises again and the one who makes alive, that is Jesus. He raises and he makes alive. And that shouldn't surprise us. Because if we go back to Genesis, the 2nd chapter, in verse 7, after God has created all of everything he's going to create. And I remember something Todd said about this when he was teaching in Genesis 2:7. And the Lord formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became what? A living soul. That was not said about any of the animals at creation, about any of the plants, anything except man. Jesus was the creator. Jesus created all that there was. And for the Creator to be able to give life and to put into man a soul that would live forever, wouldn't He not have the power to put them back together again? Then He asked Martha, "Do you believe this?" And then she says, "Yes, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." She has got an inkling, but she is nowhere near where she's going to be in a little bit. Okay.
All that, at this point, this stage of the game, all they have really on is the miracles that Jesus performed.
Yeah.
And He wasn't the only one that had performed miracles. I mean, there were others, but Jesus, proclaiming who He was, really the only thing they had was to witness the miracles that He had done.
Right.
And that would be, at that time, at that stage of it,
That would have been a big leap in faith.
it would have been.
And we're not putting her down, because the disciples didn't understand it. Whenever He said, "Lazarus is sleeping, I'm going to go wake him," they had heard, Peter, James, and John had heard Him say that the damsel sleeps in death. They should have at least figured part of it out, but they don't. And so what happens as He raises Lazarus to me is just a phenomenal thing. Yes, sir.
What I find, everything about this is amazing.
Yeah.
What I find even more amazing is that after 4 days, the composition of the body has begun to deteriorate. It's not one of those things where, we can bring him back, medically.
Yeah.
Nothing like that could happen. The organs had begun literally disintegrating within the shell of the body. So for this to happen was beyond remarkable for me, and I think that's what makes this miracle of Christ so amazing.
You're exactly right, and there are reasons what they believed about different things too about 4 days, and we'll get to that in a little bit.
He was unclean.
Exactly. Yes, ma'am. Yes,
You
Missy.
also see the characteristics of Martha, that she's not quite where Mary is. And you see that from earlier, whenever she runs out. So you see Martha's character here, but as well, I'm curious as whenever He talks about I'm the resurrection and the life, if that does not also go into the fact that we've got a new covenant coming. And that new covenant, because of everything that's happened with the Jewish nation and all of their laws and all of the things, He is resurrecting not only that, but a new covenant so that we can be free to be His people, just like He started out with them in that old picture. So is the resurrection and the life and the whole combination of everything.
It's spiritual life and spiritual resurrection as well, because He's offering them through. Yeah, you're right. She's saying that Martha's not seeing what we understand, which is Jesus isn't just giving life here, if I understand exactly what you're saying. But with the new covenant coming in, there's going to be forgiveness for everybody, because those who died and were faithful under the old covenant were cleansed and they were saved, as well as people in our generation going forward. To mention that to her would have been because it just doesn't make sense to them at this time. They don't see all this. But you're right. It's happening. And what Mike said is very true, because you talk about, they find people today that have been declared dead that are not. In fact, there was that's just mistakes on their part. But there was somebody, what did we heard about a boy that was a 13-year-old boy that when he fell and hit his head, it was, had died. I mean, he had not been breathing for 15 minutes. And I would think that was clinically dead. Yeah, they had signed away him to go, and then he wakes up. Now, you call that a miracle? No. Sometimes the body does things. But when people literally die, and there's 4 days they've been in the grave for 4 days, like Mike said, the body decays. Okay, we're going to continue. We may not get through with this. We may continue this into next week before it's over with, though. But Martha leaves, and she goes and tells Mary that the Lord wants to see you. So Mary goes. Get down here. As soon as she heard that, in verse 29, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus was not yet come to the town, but was in the place where Martha had met him. And the Jews that were with Mary in her house and comforted her, when they saw her, that she arose up hastily and went out, followed her, thinking she's going to weep at the grave. And she comes to where Jesus is, and she saw him and fell down in verse 32 at his feet, saying unto him almost exactly, in fact, I think the words are exactly in the King James, Lord, hast thou been here, my brother had not died. And she doesn't go any further with it. She expresses the same thing. Lord, and Missy made the comment also that Mary had a different level of faith. Remember whenever Jesus was dining with them at home, and Mary was sitting there listening, and Martha got a little huffy because she went to the Lord and said, Lord, tell Mary to help me serve. And what did Jesus say? She's chosen the best thing. She said, you're too worried about a lot of things. She's chosen the best. But even the sitting at the Master's feet that Mary had done did not prepare her for what's going to happen. She still believes that Jesus had to have been there to save him, and that was gone. That was now gone. And it says in verse 33, and when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. And of course we have the words, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Not the first time he wept. But this shows the humanity as well as the deity of Jesus. He knows what he's going to do. But Jesus was not, I'm trying to think how to say this the best way. Jesus was just as much an emotional person as we are. This affected Jesus. Even though he knew that Lazarus was safe, even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, this affected Jesus emotionally. His spirit was troubled in him because of this. And it may have been primarily because of what it did to his friends.
Do you think, too, Roger, that part of it might have been that Jesus allowed Lazarus to die as opposed to going immediately? But there was a greater purpose behind what he was doing, and possibly that might have caused a lot of the emotion in Christ, that you had to allow him to go ahead and die. We don't know what kind of death he suffered, but
Yeah, I think probably too. Yes, Missy.
Like, whenever mine talk about how he was angry, and I know I've talked with other people, and sometimes that Jesus wept, I think people, take as his frustration with the lack of understanding, not because of Lazarus' death, because he knows he's fine. He knows he's been there. He knows heaven, and he knows he's going to be raised. But it's the frustration of we're still not getting it. We're still not getting it.
I think he expressed that with the disciples right before he was ascended to heaven, definitely. Now, look, guys, we've been doing this for 3 years, and you still don't understand. And there probably was some frustration, but personally, I think it's more of an emotional This was his friend. And I've even heard it said or read that maybe Jesus was crying because he had to bring Lazarus back and bring him from that world that was so perfect and have him go through death again. But knowing the kind of person Lazarus was, that was not going to be any problem.
Right. I was just wondering with that Greek word, because sometimes it's a strong kind of anger.
Yeah,
So I don't know
you're-
why
yeah, I know. I went through that when my dad passed away suddenly, and it was very hard. And my wife will tell you, but he was different. And so, Jesus is a complex person. Okay, I think that's one way to say it. He had a lot of love for Lazarus. He had a lot of love for Martha and Mary. And the way he talks about it, he loved them probably on a personal basis as much as he loved anybody, maybe more. More in a phileo or personal body, friendly love as opposed to agape. I don't know that that's the word used. I didn't go back and check that. But Jesus was groaning in his spirit. And in verse 39, he tells them, remove the stone. And look what Martha says. Lord, by this time will be a stench, for he has been dead for 4 days. What has she told Jesus previously about what she believed about him? I believe that whatever you ask, God will give it to you. Okay, now wait a minute, Lord. I don't mean to go that far with this because he stinks. What is she really saying? This is now beyond that point. You don't bring people back that have been dead 4 days. The same thing Mike said. There's a belief that the Jews had, and some of the commentators referred to it. And one of them is that when a person died, the spirit hovered or stayed around the body for about 3 days, hoping to be reunited with the body again. This is what they believe. I'm not telling you this is true. But on about the 4th day, the body would start showing decay signs. And as soon as that happened, that spirit would be gone. It would not be returning. The 4 days here is proof that Lazarus was dead. Whenever he raised the widow's son, Jews normally buried their dead the day they died. There were reasons for it. Who said that he was unclean? To touch a dead body, to be around a dead body was not something a Jew wanted to be. They did what they had to do, but if you came in contact with a dead person, you were unclean, and there was things to go through, or it lasted a certain time. It wasn't sinful. It was just unclean. So, and I think one thing Mike was thinking possibly, and it ran through my mind. You know, when Jesus touched, I think he touched the body, or he touched the casket on the woman at Nain, her son. When that man comes alive, he's no longer dead. He's no longer unclean. Okay, let's come back to this next week. I'd like for you all to do some study and reading. I will. And then we're going to go to I am the way, the truth, and the life, okay? And we will start that one next week. I appreciate your comments and the discussion. It's been very interesting for me. Thank you.